Chapter 15. They were saying in chapter that the war had gone to sleep. They were saying that paying, feeding, and sheltering 40,000 men, keeping them away from the shops and the women, was a horrendous waste of effort, energy, and money if they weren't going to be set loose against anybody anytime soon. They were saying that necessary evil had lost its nerve, and its grip. Celis still hadn't found out why everything had suddenly ground to a halt. The soldiers had arrived, Vaatzes was in Aremia, up to no good there by all accounts, and there was no earthly reason he could see why the war shouldn't be over and done with inside a month, if only they'd get started. Some of the voices around the guild hall were saying it was because there was another 40,000 on the way. Celis happened to know that this was true. Others, that the enemy capital was impregnable, that Aremia had signed a secret treaty with the Vidani, the Curidoce, the Curihardi, all three simultaneously, that someone in ways and means had made a mistake, and there was only just enough food left in the country to feed the soldiers for 1 week, that the real object of the war wasn't Aremia after all, that the carpenters and joiners were planning a military coup, and that's what the army was really for, that the soldiers had found out about the defenses of Civitas Armei and were striking for double pay and death benefits. Necessary evil's response was to look smug and stay quiet. As one of its members, trying to guess which of the rumors was true, Celis found this attitude extremely annoying. Mostly though he was bored. He had nothing to do. Even the memos had stopped coming. There were no meetings. For a while he'd sat in his office afraid to leave it in case he missed a message ordering him to a briefing where everything would be explained. Then he'd tried writing to his colleagues and superiors asking what was going on, but they never answered him. He tried a series of surprise visits to their offices, but they were never there. Finally he'd taken to wandering about the guild hall on the off chance of running into one of them. That was a waste of time too. Nobody had seen them recently or knew anything about what they were up to. When he went out to the camp where the soldiers were billeted, he was turned away at the gate by the sentries. Over their shoulders he could see the peaks of thousands of tents, thin wisps of smoke rising straight up into the windless sky. He could smell the soldiers from 200 yards away, but he couldn't see them. It was like a party to which all the other children in his class had been invited. Wouldn't have been so bad if the war wasn't his fault. After a while, he'd lost track of time rather. He decided to alter his perspective. He resolved to looking at it all from a different angle. After years of stress and overwork, he told himself he was having a holiday. He still had his office, his rank, all the things he'd fought for over the years. Better still, he'd been promoted from compliance to necessary evil. If they needed him, they'd find him. Meanwhile, until the call came, he was at liberty to indulge himself. With what, though? He hadn't had more than an hour's continuous free time since he was 21, and pleasure is something you can easily lose the knack of if you allow yourself to get out of practice. Not that he'd exactly been a libertine in his remote youth. You didn't get to be a guild official by drinking and chasing girls, so he had never done any of that. And it was simple realism to admit that it was probably too late to start now. He applied his mind, sitting in his office one cold gray morning. What did people do for pleasure? Apart from drinking and being obnoxious to women. What indeed? In Byzantia, not much that he could think of. Abroad in less favored countries, they rode to hounds, flew falcons, jousted, fenced, but the Perpetual Republic had outgrown that sort of thing. What else? Well, they read books, looked at works of art, listened to music. Well, that sounded somewhat more promising. There were works of art, he was pretty sure. The sculptors and painters produced them, and, a quick glance at the relevant memo, their productivity had risen last year by an admirable 6.3%, but, he remembered, 4/5 of their output went for export, mostly to the Vidani and the Curidoce. And wherever the remaining 1/5 ended up, it wasn't anywhere he was allowed to go. Music. The musicians amalgamated with the ancillary and allied trades a century ago. Their harp was still just about visible among the quarterings on the guild's coat of arms, but he couldn't remember ever having met a guild musician. There were people who played pipes and fiddles and little drums at private functions, but they were strictly amateurs, and the practice was officially frowned upon. That left literature by default. For literature, you had to apply to the stationers and copyists. Like the sculptors, they catered mostly for the export market, but the guild had a retail outlet in a small alley off Progress Square. It was where you went to buy copies of guild decrees and regulations, set books for the further examinations, commentaries and cribs to the more complex specifications, and occasionally, usually as the result of a cancelled export order, literature. He'd been there himself half a dozen times over the years, most recently to look for a wedding present for a mildly eccentric cousin who liked poetry. It was very much the sort of place where you went to buy things for other people, not yourself. His cousin had gotten married 7 years ago, but the shop was exactly as he remembered it. The front part was given over to stationery, both export and domestic quality. There were inkwells in gold, silver plate, brass, and pewter, writing sets, plain fancy and presentation grade, loose or boxed. There was paper in staggering quantities, all types and qualities, from pads of 4 times scraped scraps sewn up with stacking twine, to virgin linen pulp contract and conveyance paper, to the very best mutton and calf vellum. He counted 30 different inks before he lost interest and gave up, and if you didn't like any of them, you could buy loose ingredients to make your own. Oak apple gall, ready dried and powdered, finest quality soot, candle knot chimney, and at the number of specialist pigments for emphasizing the operative words in legal documents or illuminating capitals. There were trays of 20 different cuts of pen nib, types 1 to 6 export only, 7 to 13 restricted to copyists only, on proof of good standing, the rest available to the public at large. Goose quills in gray, black, barred, or white, and dainty little bronze knives to cut them with. Sand shakers, seals, wax holders, seal edge smoothers to round off splodged edges, bookmarks, erasing pumice in 3 grades and 4 handy sizes, binding needles and the finest flax thread, roll covers in solid brass or tin plate with brass escutcheons for engraving book titles on. A few surreptitious glances at the price tickets showed that nearly all the stuff was not for domestic consumption, but then very little of what the guilds produced was. And in the back quarter of the shop there were books. Last time there had been 5 bookcases, but one of them had been taken out to make way for a display of chains and hasps for chained libraries. 3 of the shelves were guild publications carefully divided up into numbered and coded categories. The 4th was marked clearance, and half of its shelves were empty. A quick look round, just in case somebody he knew was watching him, then Celis began to browse. The Mirror of Fair Ladies, newly and copiously illustrated. Tempting, but how would he explain it away if someone caught him with it? A dialogue of King Fashion and Queen Reason caught his attention, mostly because of the pictures of animals being slaughtered in various improbable ways. But the text was in a language he didn't understand. A Garland of Violets turned out to be an anthology of inspirational verse, by or about great guildsmen from history, and so did a Calendar of Heroes and Line, Rule, and Calipers, but without the illuminations or pictures. He was tempted by early Mannerist lyric poetry, a parallel text in Mezentine and Luzenesque, but a previous owner had paved the Mezentine side of each page with clouds of notes and extracts from the commentaries, presumably for some exam, so it was barely legible. He was considering the practicalities of recovering the Mirror of Fair Ladies in plain brown paper when he caught sight of a name and held his breath. Elements of Chess, by Galazzo Vaatzis. It was an ancient, tatty book, perhaps as much as 30 years old. The lettering on the spine wasn't gilt cursive or italic, and the binding was rough and uneven. Pitched canvas stuck onto thin wood, packing crate lathe maybe, with rabbit skin size, the sort they used in the plasterworks. A homemade book, rather, like one he'd seen recently, and it fell open at the flyleaf, Elements of Chess, being a memorial of various innovations and strategies collected or invented by me, Galazzo Vaatzis, herein recorded for the benefit of my son Ziani on the occasion of his 4th birthday. Followed by a date. He'd been out by a year. The book was 31 years old. Back in his office, he laid the 2 books on his desk side by side. 2 acts of love. One by a father to his son, the other he assumed by a husband to his wife. Between them, they were trying to tell him something. Well, the purpose of a book is to communicate, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. One of them, in the Abominator's awkward and labored love poetry, had a nice clean provenance, but how had the other got here? Someone had brought it in, on its own or together with other books, and sold it. His first thought was the liquidator of confiscated assets, but there had been a specific order against confiscation in the Vaatzis case, and why was that? And all the chattels at the Vaatzis house had reverted to the wife as her unencumbered property, so maybe Ziani Vaatzis had sold it himself at some point when he needed money, as so many people did from time to time. Entirely plausible, but he doubted it, unless Ziani hadn't got on with his father and therefore had no qualms about getting rid of the book. He could have given it to a friend as a present, and the friend disposed of it. He looked again. The younger Vaatzes was a better craftsman than his father, but at least the old man hadn't purported to write poetry. Just for curiosity's sake, he played out one or two of Galatza Vaatzi's gambits in his mind, memories of playing chess with his own father, who never managed to grasp the simple fact that children need to win occasionally, and found them unexpectedly ingenious. After the first 4 or so, they became too complicated for him to follow without a board and a set of pieces in front of him, but he was prepared to take their merits on trust. The 7th gambit was annotated in handwriting he knew. At some point, Ziani had found a flaw in his father's strategy and made a note of it to remind himself. Do engineers usually make good chess players? He thought about that. He could think of 1 or 2, his father, his uncle, but he'd never been any great shakes at the game himself. The data was inconclusive. The effort involved in making the book, there was something in that, he felt sure. Was it a family tradition, the making of books out of scrounged and liberated materials? Interesting if it was. And had the person who sold this one also disposed of further generations of the tradition? Only one shop in Byzantia, but perhaps all the rest had already been bought by the time he got there. He found himself back at that strange moment of disposal. Who had sold the book and why? Wherever I go, he thought, he follows me, like a ghost haunting me, trying to tell me something. As to why he would choose me to confide in, mystifying, but perhaps simply there's nobody else with the inclination, and of course the leisure, to listen. He closed his eyes and found himself watching a chess game, father against son, father winning, unable to defy his principles and lose on purpose, angry that his son is such a weak opponent. He wants his son to beat him, but refuses to give anything away. The father is, of course, Matteo Tselis, and the son is poor disappointment Lukau, who never really liked the game anyway, and so he applied himself to a different but similar game, whose gambits and ploys have brought him here. Matteo Tselis never wrote a book for his son. It would never have occurred to him to do anything of the sort. Yet here were 2 books, 2 acts of stifled love, like water bursting through a cracked pipe and soaking away into the dirt. As he studied them, Tselis felt sure he could sense the presence of a third, whereby the chess book had come into his hands, but he couldn't quite make it out. He could see the end result, but not the workings of the mechanism by which that result was achieved. Ariessa Vaatzes, she needed money, and she knows he's never coming back. Even so, he thought, even so. She might have sold his clothes, which were replaceable, or the furniture, or anything else. What would she have got for it? Well, he'd paid 2 doubles and a turner, the price of 3 spring cabbages. Suppose she'd got half that or a third. You can eat cabbages, but not a book, said a small, starved voice in his mind. And it had a point, but he was prepared to concede. But he was sure there was more to it than that. It was all beside the point, since Vaatzes would be dead soon, along with the Uremians and quite a few of those invisible soldiers he wasn't allowed to see. He put one book away, opened the other, put his feet up on the desk, holiday, remember, and tried to visualize a chessboard. Lukau, the voice came from above and behind. I'm glad to see we're not working you to death. He sat up sharply, dragging his feet off the desk. The book shot out onto the floor, and the spine burst. Zanipolo, he said. There you are at last. I've been trying to talk to you for ages. Quite, Starakis replied. Well, here I am. Meeting in 10 minutes in the cloister. Perhaps you didn't get the memo. Memo? Tselis looked up at him stupidly as though he'd never heard the expression before. No, I haven't seen any memos. As he said it, he caught sight of a piece of paper on the desk that hadn't been there when he'd left to go shopping. It said memorandum at the top in big square letters. Sorry, well, just as well I checked, Starakis said, and he left. Tselis snatched at the paper, his sleeve fanned up in a breeze that wafted it just beyond the reach of his fingers off the desk onto the floor, and he sighed, stooped, and retrieved it. The war had woken up, apparently. No explanation, just as there'd been none when it was cancelled or adjourned. He read the memo again, just in case he'd missed something. 10 minutes. He could just about reach the cloister if he ran. Splendid, said Jarnak Duckus. A big smile split his handsome sun-tanned face, curling the ends of his mustache down over the corners of his mouth. He tapped the lower plate of a gorget with his knuckle. It sounded like someone knocking at a door. Well, there's still 2 sets of quizzes to do, Ziani said, watching him, but they'll be ready in plenty of time. I'll bring them with me on the day, shall I? Just the faintest of frowns, until Jarnak remembered that Ziani was invited to the hunt. Oh yes, why not? That'll be fine. Excellent work. You must let me know how much I owe you. Behind him, Kantakaseni was standing awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as though being in the presence of a scion of the Duchess was more honor than he could endure. Extraordinary the attitude of these people. What puzzled Ziani was the fact that he himself had never shown the slightest degree of deference or respect to any of them, not even Mille Ducas or the Duke, and nobody had seemed to notice. Because he was a foreigner, presumably. "I've been reading the books you lent me," Ziani went on, another slight frown. Jarnac had forgotten he'd set round copies of King Fashion in the mirror. "Fascinating stuff. I'm looking forward to it." "Splendid!" Jarnac's smile widened. It was entirely possible that he genuinely enjoyed giving pleasure to others less fortunate than himself, provided it was one of his own pleasures, and he wouldn't have to go without in order to do so. "So we might make a huntsman of you yet, then." He looked away, back at the sets of newly buffed and polished armor laid out on the long table. He really did seem pleased. "Why am I surprised?" Ziani thought. "Well, I'll have it sent round this evening if that's convenient," he said. "Obviously, there may need to be a few adjustments for fit and so forth." Jarnac nodded. Probably he wasn't listening. It was difficult being in the presence of somebody this large. He wasn't just taller and broader than anyone Ziani had ever seen before. It was as though he used space in a different way, as though he was used to a much bigger world and hadn't quite adjusted to living among midgets. "Excellent work," he said. "First rate. And I'll be seeing you on the day, of course. Can't promise anything. You never can in hunting. But I've been setting aside the beaches above the Long Lake. We haven't been in there with the limers or the wolfhounds, and the farmers reckon there's been at least one big boar rootling around there. I'll be setting someone up to feed the outer covers, see if we can't draw a hog or two out from the thick stuff in the middle. They won't stick around during the day, of course, but at least there'll be a trail for the dogs to follow." Ziani smiled pleasantly. He had an idea that Jarnac talked mostly to himself through the medium of his listeners. It would be nice, however, if he could make him go away so he could get on with his work. "Would you like to see round the factory?" he said. "We've just finished putting in a new treadle saw. I believe it's the only one of its kind outside Mazentia." Infallible. It's a curious fact that boring people seem to have a mortal fear of being bored by others. Jarnac thanked and congratulated him once again, reminded him to send in his bill as soon as possible, and strode away, ducking to avoid the beams in the doorframe. "Pleasant enough man," Ziani observed, "but I prefer his cousin, the other Duchess. Doesn't talk quite so much." Kantakaseni looked at him. "He's the cadet branch," he said. "Jarnac Duchess, I mean." "Ah," Ziani said. "Is that a good thing? I don't understand about nobility." "It means Jarnac won't ever be in line to be head of the family, not unless all the other branches get wiped out before he does." "I see. So really Jarnac isn't anyone special." A look of disgust and horror flitted across Kantakaseni's face, and Ziani realized he'd committed yet another abomination. He wasn't all that interested anyway. He wanted to get the last few bits of leather cut out so he could go and look at the scorpion locks. Kantakaseni walked away, clearly not trusting himself to speak. In the main shop, they were cutting quarter-inch plate on the big shear. It was, if anything, worse than the leather shear he'd been using himself. It wasn't even mezzanine made, and the handle was a broken-off stub, with a length of bent iron pipe pinned over it. Luckily, the tolerances for the lock plates were broad. He didn't recognize any of the faces around him, but they'd all know who he was, the only brown-skinned man in Aremia. Some of them looked up. Others looked in the opposite direction. All in all, he'd met with far less resentment and hatred than he'd expected, given that his people had only recently massacred the flower of the Aremian army. An Aremian wouldn't last a day in the ordnance factory at home. He left them to it and wandered over to the filing bench, where two men were cutting teeth into gear wheels. They were better at it than he'd expected. They were standing right, weight on both feet equally, square to the bench, holding the file level and true. He'd marked out the pattern piece himself. All they had to do was scribe round it on each wheel, then follow the scribed lines in, closely as they could. Back home, of course, a machine would be doing this job 100 times faster and much more accurately. One of the men was old. His thin, wiry forearms ended in broad, clenched hands with huge knuckles, and he bent close over his work to be able to see the scratched line. Ziani saw that he'd rubbed the piece over with candle soot mixed with spit to make the line show up better. At home they used a special dark blue paste. "How's it going?" he asked. He noticed that he was speaking a bit louder than usual, either because he assumed the old man must be deaf or because subconsciously he was imitating Jarnac Duchess. The man didn't look up. "This file's no good," he said. "Blunt." "Chalk it," Ziani said. "Done that," the old man said, "and carded it. No good. It's not clogged, it's blunt." "Let me see," Ziani said. It was a mezzanine 3-square file with a guild mark. The letter next to the stamped lion's head told him it was no more than a year old. He ran the pad of his finger around the teeth. "You're right," he said. "Funny. Have you been hardening steel with it?" The old man shook his head. "It's my best file," he said. "Only ever use it for brass and Latin." For some reason, Ziani couldn't help taking it personally. His guild had made the file to specification, so it ought to be perfect, but it had failed before its time, and that was wrong. The foreman of the tool works ought to be on charges for something like that. "I'll get you a new one," Ziani said, and went to go, but the old man grabbed his arm. "Where are you going with my file?" he said. "But it's no good," Ziani said. "You said so yourself." "Well, it's my file. Give it back." Ziani put it down on the bench, went to the tool chest in the corner, and found a 3-square file, brown new, still in its grease. "Here," he said to the old man. "Yours to keep." The old man scowled at it, took it, rubbed his fingertip over the base of the tang where the guild marks were. "Needs a handle," he said. Ziani picked a file at random off the bench, knocked the handle off against the bench leg, and handed it to him. He tapped it into place, then put the file carefully away in his apron pocket. "Fine," Ziani said. "Apart from the blunt file, how's it going?" The old man shrugged. "Foreman said file out the notches in these wheels, so that's what I'm doing. Don't ask me what they're for, I don't know." "Well, how many have you managed to get done today?" Ziani asked, but either the old man hadn't heard him, or the question was too offensive to be answered. "Carry on," Ziani said, and moved away. On the next bench, they were bending ratchet sears over formers in a vise. Nice simple work. At home, the sears would be machined from solid and case-hardened bone meal and leather dust, but the 3 men were doing it and had filled one box with finished pieces and half-filled another. He watched them open the vise, clamp a strip of shear-cut plate between the former and the jaw, tighten up the vise, and bend the piece with thumps from a hide mallet until it lay flat against the former. At the end of the bench, another man worked a long lever punch, drifting out the pivot holes. The punch was pretty deplorable, too, but he had only himself to blame for it. He'd made him himself in a tearing hurry, and he knew it would break soon, and the hinge pin would need replacing. It wounded him to think that something he'd made himself would inevitably fail. The day wore on. For the first time since he'd escaped from Azentia, Ziani was aware of being very tired. Everything he did cost him effort, and he couldn't settle to anything. He remembered, just as the men were leaving for the day, that he hadn't made arrangements for taking the finished pieces of armor to Jarnak's house. By then, he and Kantakaseni were the only people left in the building. "Fine. Do me a favor," he said, leaning against the doorpost of the small foundry where Kantakaseni had set up his leather-boiling cauldron. Kantakaseni was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a chunky oak log gripped between his knees. Over it he was hammering a quise, stretching the leather back into shape where it had crinkled slightly in the boiling water. "What?" he said. "Give me a hand delivering this lot," Ziani replied. He hadn't been expecting it, but Kantakaseni nodded without argument or even face-pulling. "All right," he said, "just let me finish this before it cools down." So Ziani watched for a while as Kantakaseni tapped and poked and wheedled, then dunked the quise into a bucket of cold water to set it. It came out dripping. He wiped it over with his sleeve and stood it against the wall to dry off. "Nearly all done," he said. "Should finish off tomorrow." Together they packed the armor in straw and loaded it in 6 barrels, which they lugged out into the yard and dumped in the cart they were using for fetching iron stock and charcoal. Kantakaseni harnessed up the tool mules while Ziani locked up. Then they set out. They had to go a very long way round, because the straight way was too narrow for the cart and there were stairs and bridges. They rode in silence most of the way, but Ziani could sense that Kantakaseni was winding himself up to ask something. When it came in a rush. "You didn't tell me you were going on this hunt." "Yes, I did," Ziani replied. "You remember when this Jarnak character came round to order the stuff." Kantakaseni frowned. "Why?" "I don't know," Ziani said. "I guess I thought it would be good to see how it's done. If there's a market for hunting gear, it's a good idea to see for myself what goes on. And I'm curious," he added. "There's nothing like it at home." "Did he invite you?" "Sort of," Ziani grinned. "I dropped some heavy hints. You ever been?" Kantakaseni shook his head. "Strictly for the gentry," he said. "Except if you're beating or carrying or picking up and stuff. Mostly, though, the household does all that. They only hire in casuals for the really big meets, and it's country people that tend to get hired, not anyone from the city." "Right," Ziani said. "Yeah, I think this is going to be a big occasion with the Duke going." You can be sure of that, Kantakaseni said. Orsi's not a great one for hunting mind. He likes it, but they reckon he never finds the time. His father Orsiola was big on the falcons, but not riding to hounds. But of course they never had the money for a decent pack or good horses. Costs a fair bit, see. Tiani nodded. But Jarnak can afford it, obviously. Well, the Duchess, Kantakaseni said, with a subtle mixture of respect and contempt. They've got all the money you can think of, even the cadet line. Though they reckon that what with Jarnak spends, he does cut it a bit close sometimes. It was amusing, Ziani thought, how Kantakaseni, the dour and silent, became so animated when he got onto the subject of the nobility. It wasn't anything like the attitude he'd have expected. Resentment, he'd have thought, maybe even downright hatred. After all, the nobles did no work and lived off the sweated labor of others, wasting enough on their idle and vicious pleasures in a month to feed 50 working families for a year. He'd have expected someone like Kantakaseni to froth at the mouth when talking about such people. Apparently not. The closest thing in his experience was the way people back home talked about the dog racing or handball teams they supported. Get a Mezzantine guildsman started on his team, and he'd tell you every minute detail. Life, histories, and career statistics of every player, arcane details of rules and form, which tracks favored which pitchers, more than any rational man could possibly want to know about anything. In the same way, Kantakaseni seemed to come alive talking about the Duchess, with whom he had nothing in common except occasional commissions and a wedge of unpaid invoices for work delivered. It was touching and revolting at the same time, this vicarious enjoyment of the gentry's lifestyle. For some reason, Kantakaseni supported the Duchess, and the Phocas, and the Stratiatus, and up the point, the Kalanixias, which somehow gave him the right to refer to them by their first names, as though they were his own family, and to preen himself on their ridiculous achievements, hunting, politicking, marrying and giving in marriage, bickering over land, and dabbling disdainfully and half-competently in trade. For a long time, all the way from Lantern Street to Wallgate via Shaved Cross, he grabbled about genealogies and lawsuits, trophy stags and champion destriers, with a counterpoint of scandals, infidelities, and indiscretions, which he seemed to take in equal pride. By the time they came out onto Fountain Street and started to climb the long cobbled ride up to the old lists where the Cadet Duchess had their townhouse, Ziani reckoned he'd learned enough about the family to fill 2 epic poems and 9 books of commentaries. The only other one of them I've actually met, he broke in, during a brief lull, is Meal Duchess. He's the head of the family, isn't he? Kantakaseni nodded vigorously. Ever since his uncle died, old Acer Duchess. Mind, he was only head because his first cousin, Selat, died young. Bust his neck riding in the forest, the bloody fool. If it hadn't been for that, Acer would have been nobody. Of course, he was 70 if he was a day when he came into the honor. Up till then, he'd just been collateral in the main line. And everybody expected him to peg out and Selat to take over when Geralt died. But Selat died, 7 years back? Geralt went on the year after that, which meant Acer took over and he only lasted 6 months, and then it was Meal. Youngest Duchess this century. Ziani frowned. So Meal wasn't really anybody important till 6 years ago. Oh, he was important, Kantakaseni snapped, as though Ziani had just insulted his mother. Leading collateral heir? He'd have copped for the minor honor in the main line when Acer died, but actually being the Duchess, that's something else entirely. I don't suppose you can understand that, not being from here. Ziani shrugged. He's always come across to me as a pleasant enough man, he said. Quite quiet, very polite. I'm starting to see that that's what I should have expected, but I'd been assuming the head of the family would be more like Jarnak and the also-ran would have been more like Meal. But really it's got to be the other way around, hasn't it? Kantakaseni was torn. He could see between 2 powerful forces. On the one hand, extreme discomfort at Ziani's disrespectful attitude. On the other, the glorious opportunity to tell an ignorant foreigner all about the Duchess. Luckily, the opportunity won the day. Well, it's something you've got to understand about the good families, Kantakaseni said. What they live by is duty. Duty to the family, traditions and stuff. Duty to the Duke and the country. Nothing means more to them than that. So the higher up they are, the more the duty sort of weighs on them, if you see what I mean. Really, all Jarnak's got to do is to keep up to what's expected of him. Like, he's got to dress well, he's got to hold big fancy banquets and dinners, he's got to have the best stables and hounds and hawks. This is in peacetime, of course. and generally have the best of everything and be the best at everything, if you get me. It's not his place to be getting into politics and government at all, or being a counselor or a minister or anything. Cadet branch, see? But Meal, it's different for him. If he was to go putting on a big show, talking loud and that stuff, it wouldn't be suitable. It would be out of place. Not the right way for a senior man in the state to go on. He's got to be a serious man, you see. Polite, quiet, all that, like you said. I see, Ziani said. Part of the job, then. Well, he's very good at it. Count Ixeni laughed. Didn't used to be, he said. Of course, he got that scat in the face, which spoiled his looks. But before he got the honor, when he was more like Sharnak is now, if you follow me, he was a real bright spark, especially with the girls. Ziani frowned. Because it was expected of him. Gotta be the best at everything, Count Ixeni said. And I suppose you could say he was back then. Oh, I could tell you stories. I'm sure, Ziani said. It was dark by the time they arrived at the list gate. They were directly under the shadow of the highest point of the keep wall. Being the cadet branch, the lesser Ducas lived outside the inner castle. Being Ducas, they lived as close to it as they could possibly get. Count Ixeni turned off the paved highway, down a narrow alley. The wheel hubs fouled the brickwork on both sides simultaneously as they turned a corner. That twisted to and fro up a slope between high walls until it came to a small door in a dark stone frontage. If it hadn't been a dead end, Ziani wouldn't have noticed it. Count Ixeni jumped down and clubbed on the planking with the heel of his fist. You've been here before then, Ziani said. Been here delivering, never gone inside, of course. The door opened just enough to give them sight of a pale blue eye and a wisp of grey hair. Ziani Va'atsis, Ziani said. Delivery. The owner of the eye and the hair came out and looked at him for a moment. You're to fetch it into the great hall, he said. He's in his bath, but he'll be down as soon as he's ready. For a moment Ziani was sure Count Ixeni would refuse to pass the door, like a horse shying at a jump. Curiosity must have got the better of awe for once, and he shuffled along after Ziani, holding up one end of the first barrel and muttering something under his breath. The courtyard that separated them from the inner gate was laid out as a formal garden with neatly trimmed, knee-high hedges of lavender and box, surrounding square or diamond-shaped beds, where closely mustered ranks of roses, quartered with lilies and some kind of blue flower they didn't have in Mezentia, filled out the shape of the Ducas family arms. The effect wasn't immediately obvious from the ground, but if a god happened to look down from the clouds, he'd be left in no doubt as to who lived there. A fountain dribbled quietly and unheated in the exact center of the arrangement, feeding a small pond that probably housed small and inedible fish. While Ziani and Count Ixeni were manhandling the barrel along the gravel path, someone had opened the inner gate, which led into a cloister, a roofed-over hollow square enclosing a larger garden with a lawn and an almond tree. The cloister itself was paved with polished limestone slabs. The walls were painted with scenes of Ducas family history, including one involving a small pig-like dragon up against a huge bearded Ducas, Kappa P in armor. It didn't stand a chance. And Ziani and Count Ixeni toiled round 3 sides of the cloister and arrived at a set of broad, shallow steps leading up to a massive, studded oak door, which opened inward as they approached it. The hall they found themselves in was smaller than the guild hall, or the main gallery of the ordnance factory. It was the height of the roof that set Ziani's head swimming. He couldn't begin to guess how far up the sheer walls went until they sprouted a jungle of beams, plates, and purlins, all painted and gilded, carved and embossed with flowers, animals, birds, gargoyles, severely frowning heads of the ancient Ducas, stars, suns, and moons. He might have been able to cope with the sheer size if it hadn't been for the fact that every available square foot of wall was adorned with trophies of the hunt. There were forests of antlers, dense as an orchard, heads, skulls, escutcheons of boar tusks, bear's claws, and wolf's fangs arranged in circles, half-circles, and spirals. Claws, paws, tails, hoofs, enough spare parts to build a herd of composite monsters. Stuffed herons, partridges, rock grouse, pigeons swung overhead on wires suspended from rafters frozen in perpetuity in a desperate flight from stuffed peregrines, goshawks, merlins, and buzzards, their shadows huge and dramatic in the yellow glare of 1,200 candle chandeliers. At the far end of the hall, flanking the high table on its raised platform, stood 2 enormous bears, rearing up on their hind legs, their forepaws raised to strike. Directly behind the massive high-backed chair, in the dead center of the table, hung a wooden shield, on which the skull of an absurdly large wolf bared its fangs at all comers. Underneath each trophy, in lettering too small to read, was an inscription, painted on a billowing scroll. Leave it here, someone said, a short bald man with a gold chain round his neck. Some kind of steward. More to come? Ziani nodded. 5 more, he replied. The steward nodded as if to say he'd feared as much. No, you stay here, he added, as Ziani turned round to go back out just the way they'd came. I'll send a couple of men to get them. You sit down. I'll get someone to fetch you a drink. He went away. Hospitality, service, disdain. The duckus for you. Kantakaseni sat down on the nearest bench, but Ziani strolled across the floor to get a better look at some of the trophies. Closest to him was a group of roebuck skulls, and he noticed that their antlers were all malformed, one horn normal, the other looking as if it had been melted, squashed, or worn away. King Fashion had prepared him for that. Abnormals, the king called him, and they were far more highly prized as trophies than larger regular specimens. The duckus clearly had an outstanding collection. Every conceivable irregularity, deformation, and variation from the orthodox was represented, from great splayed fans of horn to pathetic little needles. He grinned in spite of himself, because here, honored and treasured in death, was a glorious gallery of abominations, enough to make the whole compliance directorate die of revulsion. It reminded him of the fairy stories about lovely women pursued by amorous gods, rescued and set among the stars as constellations, just as dead as any other mortal, but on show forever, trophies of the hunt. That in turn made him think of Neil Duckus, a great chaser of women in his day, according to what he'd heard. He owed that mental leap, he knew, to King Fashion's insufferable arch-consort, Queen Reason, whose job it was to point out each of the king's pithy hints with a parallel from the world of courtly love. To Queen Reason, the fleeing doe was the coy maiden, glancing over her shoulder as she fled, no doubt, and the hunter was the amorous youth armed with sighs and tears and vows everlasting, his nets and snares and arrows. Ziani had skipped most of her side of the dialogue on the grounds that life was too short, but occasionally the queen had succeeded in ambushing him, the hunter lying in wait in Bowen's stable as the young lover looking in the rose arbor, sonnet properly braced, its blade smeared with honey. The boar at bay among the hounds is the nymph beset by eligible suitors, reaching somewhat there, he felt. The partridge, circling to avoid the swooping goshawk, is the minx playing hard to get, and so on interminably, while her husband the king politely ignores her and lectures earnestly on the shapes of droppings. The only explanation Ziani could think of was that Reason was a mistranslation of the wretched woman's name. Sullen-looking men lugged in the other barrels, and there was no longer any reason for Ziani to stay, so he stood up. The drink had never arrived, but he hadn't been expecting it to. In a week's time he imagined a footman would approach the bench with 2 cups on a tray and find nobody there to take them, and nodded to Kantakaseni to follow him, like a dog. So, he said, as they got back into the cart, what did you make of it? What? Ziani frowned. Jarnak's house, was it as magnificent as you'd imagined? Kantakaseni shrugged. It was very nice, he said. He dropped Kantakaseni off on the way and drove home alone. He was starting to get the hang of managing horses, and luckily they knew the way. He managed to get the harness off them without drawing blood, threw them some hay, and went back to his cellar. He didn't feel so tired now. Maybe it was the fresh air or the melodrama of the lesser duckus. The steel bow was leaning against the wall where he'd left it, and he'd practiced for over an hour until the scars on his fingers were raw again. Then he climbed the stairs to the tower and put in a session with the Mirror of the Chase, which was slightly less turgid than King Fashion, but which also had a love interest. I'd put him to sleep until just before first light. He woke up with a crick in his neck and went downstairs to look at the scorpions. A day and a half, and the first batch would be finished. They were drawn up in rows, like vines in a vineyard, and he walked up and down between them. All that was left was basic assembly and fitting, and although he hated them for being crude, he loved them for being there at all, against the odds, like a farmer who's raised a thin crop in dry, stony soil, where by rights nothing should grow at all. The night before the hunt, after he'd tried on the leather armor made by the foreigner, looking in on the kennels and the stables, given a final briefing to the huntsman, heard the most recent reports from the harbourers concerning the last known movements of the quarry, Jarnak Duckus left the main hall by the small door in the top left corner of the room, climbed a long circular stair, walked down a narrow corridor, and eventually came out on the rampart of the castle wall. When he was a boy, he'd loved the thrill of this genuine secret passage. Only male Duckus over the age of 12 knew about it, that linked the house with the castle itself. He'd imagined himself escaping down it while savage enemies looted below, fighting every step of the way until he reached the narrow sally port in safety. He must have killed a dozen imaginary goblins or Vidani for every yard. Now he was older, and the house belonged to him, and he valued it as a means of getting some air, peace, and quiet without the risk of meeting anybody. The sentry on duty knew him by sight, of course. Officially, the passage wasn't there, so the soldier looked straight through him, as though he didn't exist either. At this time of night, he knew he'd have this stretch of rampart to himself. It was a valuable privilege, one of many, and naturally he knew better than to abuse it by overuse. He turned his back on the castle, leaned his forearms on the battlements, and stared out over the city towards the mountains. All he could see of them was a ridge of shadow against the paler darkness of the night sky, but he knew they were there. He heard someone behind him, a boot heel scuffing the stone. Whoever it was seemed not to have noticed him, standing still in the dark. The steps moved away, then stopped. Not the sentry, then. He stepped away from the battlement. Jarnac? The voice was easily recognized. Duke Orsi had always had a tendency to be a little high-pitched when he was surprised or nervous. Understandable that he should be slightly apprehensive coming across someone lurking in the shadows on a wall where nobody was supposed to be. Of course, he knew about the non-existent secret passage. He'd been led down it when he was an unimportant boy, a tag-along, allowed to join in because he was Cousin Meal's friend. Now, however, Jarnac considered protocol. My lord would be inappropriate here since they were alone, and Orsi had greeted him by his private name. "Hello, Orsi," he replied. "Sorry, did I make you jump?" Orsi came a step closer, still wary, like a dog approaching an unidentified object. When he was close enough for his face to be visible, Jarnac saw the worried frown relax, though not completely. "Came up for a breath of air," Jarnac explained. "Hope you don't mind." No, of course not." Orsi had never been more than a moderately competent liar at best. "It's just, I wasn't expecting anybody to be up here, that's all." "Me too," Jarnac replied with a grin. "So, looking forward to tomorrow?" Orsi smiled. "Well, I'll expect you've got something special lined up." "You can't line up wild animals," Jarnac replied. "All you can do is hope they'll be there. No promises, but we'll see." Orsi nodded, gravely. "Thanks for arranging it all," he said. "Beatrice has been keeping me on about needing a day in the fresh air." "Quite right," Jarnac said. "You're looking a bit peaky. Too many council meetings and state receptions and not enough healthy exercise." He saw Orsi stiffen slightly, and remembered that he'd always been quick to take offense. Probably, too, he was thinking about a certain occasion 15 years ago, when Jarnac and Druifer's Focus had pushed him into the old disused cesspit behind the lesser Focus stables. Offhand, Jarnac couldn't recall the reason, but he was sure there'd been one. "That's right," Orsi said, maintaining his smile with a degree of effort. "It's what comes of getting mixed up in politics, you know." Jarnac nodded. "Well, glad I stayed clear of it, then," he said. "Always struck me as a mug's game. Glad to leave it to you and Cousin Meal. He's coming tomorrow, isn't he? Only I hadn't heard back from him." "Oh, yes, he's coming." Orsi reinforced the statement with a brisk nod just to clear up any ambiguity. "And Ferenz Bardanis and your cousin Eric, apparently. I haven't seen either of them for ages." Now Orsi mentioned it, Ferenz had also been present during the cesspit incident. Not Eric, though. He'd been off snogging with Suspiria Meletus out behind the old lime kilns. Orsi had been rather keen on Suspiria around the time, he fancied. Wasting his time, of course. "If Meal's coming, we'll be a field of 30, Jarnac said. "No, scrub that 31, I invited the Mezzantine. The blacksmith, he kept dropping hints, so I thought, why not?" Orsi shrugged. "I believe you've met him," Jarnac went on. "A couple of times, yes." "Strange man," Jarnac said. "Very much the oily tradesman one minute, then cold as a snake the next. Well, that's Mezzantines for you, I suppose. How's Beatrice?" "What? Oh, she's fine." "Is she coming?" "No." "Didn't think she would be," Jarnac said. "Not really her thing. I remember she did come out with us once years ago." That would be when everybody expected her to marry Meal, of course. Not long after she came back from playing hostage with the Vidani. "Oh," Orsi said. "She didn't like it much," Jarnac said. "Well, it was a foul day, lashing down with rain. We didn't find all morning. Lunch went to the wrong place, so she didn't get anything to eat. And then we had a long, hard chase in the afternoon. I think she was with the party that went the wrong way. I don't really blame her for thinking it's an overrated pastime, really." Orsi laughed, a sound like the last drops gurgling out of a bottle. "She'd thought about coming, actually, but she decided she'd rather stay at home and catch up with writing letters or something." He looked away. Something bothering him, Jarnac thought. Just for a split second, he caught himself remembering Beatrice Siropati as she's been when she was 16. Definitely worth stopping to look at back then, though in his opinion she'd gone off quite a bit since she married Orsi. Not that he'd ever looked too closely, since she'd always been earmarked for Meal. They'd have gone well together, he'd always thought, Neil and Beatrice Patty, if it hadn't been for the politics. He decided it would be a good idea to change the subject. So, he said, do you think there's going to be a war? Orsi looked at him, as though he'd let slip a deadly secret. I hope not, he said. We're still picking up the pieces after the last one, and the one before that. Sharnak shrugged. Some of us were talking about it the other day, he said, about Duke Valen's just happening to be there on his side of the butter pass when you were on your way back from Byzantia. It was a bit of a coincidence, we thought. For a moment, Orsi looked like he didn't follow, and Jarnak realized he'd misunderstood. He'd been thinking about a possible war right enough, but not against the Vidani. Well, that was interesting in itself. I think that's all it was, Orsi said, sounding a little bit awkward, and very lucky for us the way things turned out. Oh, quite right, and they helped us out, no question about it. Jornak paused. Probably not a good idea to be harping on about the disastrous Byzantia expedition, given that he hadn't been there. The stupid part of it was he'd really wanted to go, and he'd been furious about missing it, but people got funny about that sort of thing after disaster. Well, I'm glad to hear that you don't think there's a danger, Sharnak said. We could do without any major excitements for a while. I think I'll go get some sleep, Orsi said, and if I'm getting up early in the morning. First light, I think Meal said, in the stable yard. A bit before, if you can manage it, Sharnak corrected him. I want to be right up on the mountain while the dew's still on the grass. Right, Orsi said with an obvious lack of enthusiasm. Bright and early. I'll say good night then. Sleep well, Sharnak replied. Wish I could, but I get a bit wound up before a big day. Back down the secret passage, into the long corridor, halfway down the circular stair. Sharnak remembered that it hadn't been Suspiria Miletus that Eric was with that time, but Suspiria Poisordis. Not that it made any odds. Orsi had fancied her, too. He didn't bother going to bed, but instead he called for a lamp and sat alone in the great hall under Uncle Dara's record wolf, with a big cup of hot milk and cinnamon and a copy of his White's The Complete Record of the Hunt, where there was something about mid-season 3-year-old boars and how you could track them on stony ground, except he couldn't recall offhand where it came in the book. He found what he was looking for 2 hours before dawn, when the first light blue stain was starting to soak through, but it was just the same old stuff out of Verona rehashed. He stood up, yawned, and stretched. It was tomorrow already, and his big day had begun. Ziani rolled off his mattress, got up, and ate the crust of the stale bread. Not, he decided, a civilized hour of the morning. But he felt stronger once he'd washed his face and put on a fresh shirt. He really hadn't slept well, partly nerves, partly because a bad dream had woken him in the small hours, and he'd found it hard to get back to sleep again. Or he'd been afraid to, because he always reacted badly to nightmares. It wasn't a new dream, by any means. Originally, it had been his grandfather's fault, because the old fool was one of those people who believed that children enjoy being scared out of their wits. Accordingly, when Ziani was 6 or 7, he'd told him the legend of the storm hunt, and the horrible thing had lodged in the back of his mind ever since. Easy enough to guess why it had come back out of the shadows tonight, when his mind was stuffed with King Fashion and the Mirror and similar garbage, all that stuff about hounds and limers and bratchets, the baying of the pack and the horn calls. In Granddad's story, of course, the hounds were red-eyed and black as coal, the horns were blown by dead men riding on dead horses, and the hunt was led by King Utan the Terrible, who rode away to hounds 500 years before and never came back except on dark nights when the wind was high and the wild geese were flying low. Ever since then, in his dream, King Utan had worn a deep black hood and ridden a huge black horse, and sometimes Iani had been running away from him, and sometimes he'd been riding beside him, so close the cloak's hem flicked his face and he could smell the rain-soaked cloth. The end was always the same. Horns blowing wildly, rain stinging in his eyes, the hounds pressing round in a circle over something lying on the ground, while the king reached up with his old, swollen hands and started to lift the cowl away from his face.